George Burns walked onto the Tonight Show stage on January 10th, 1989, and did something that nobody in that studio had ever seen before. Not in 30 years of television. Not in 3,000 episodes. He stopped at the edge of the curtain, looked out at the audience of 300 people, looked at Johnny Carson sitting behind his famous desk, and instead of walking toward him, he just stood there. Still. Quiet, the cigar in his left hand sending a thin curl of smoke toward the studio lights. And then he spoke 5 words into the silence that made every camera operator in that building freeze. 5 words that had nothing to do with comedy, nothing to do with his new book, his upcoming shows, his Oscar, his movies. 5 words that nobody had scripted, nobody had rehearsed, and nobody on earth could have predicted from a man who had spent 9 decades making people laugh. What George Burns said in that moment, before he even sat down, before a single joke was told, before Johnny could say a single word of welcome, would become the most replayed clip in Tonight Show history. And the reason it hit so hard, the reason grown men watching from their living rooms across America found themselves completely unable to speak, had nothing to do with the joke. It had everything to do with the number. Because George Burns was 92 years old, 10 days away from 93. And he had just said something that nobody who has ever lived that long, who has seen everything he had seen, who has buried everyone he ever loved, should have been able to say with that particular light in his eyes. But why did that single moment crack something open in Johnny Carson that he had been holding closed for nearly 30 years of hosting? And what did George Burns know about Johnny that the rest of America did not? Stay with this story. The answer will change how you see every year you have left. January 10th, 1989. The Tonight Show was taped at NBC Studios on West Alameda Avenue in Burbank, California, recording at 5:30 in the afternoon for broadcast at 11:30 that night. Johnny Carson had been hosting this program for 26 years. He had sat behind that desk through assassinations and moon landings and Watergate and the slow unwinding of everything America thought it knew about itself. He had interviewed presidents and murderers and saints and frauds. He had held his composure through 30,000 nights of television. But this particular Tuesday afternoon, something was different from the moment the day began. The stage manager, a quiet...
I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
A quiet man named Robert Collier, who had worked The Tonight Show for 11 years, noticed it first. Johnny arrived early, which was not unusual, but he went directly to his dressing room and closed the door, and through the wall you could hear nothing. Not the television, not the radio, not the murmur of someone running lines or reading cards, just silence. His producer, Fred de Cordova, knocked twice at 4:15 and got a muffled answer that meant leave me alone. Fred left him alone. He had learned over the years that on certain nights, certain guests required something from Johnny that could not be explained in a production meeting. George Burns was one of those guests. He always had been. But tonight was different because George Burns was not just coming on The Tonight Show. George Burns was coming on The Tonight Show at 92 years old, still performing stand-up comedy, still booking theaters, still lighting the same cigar brand he had been smoking since before most of the people in that studio were born. And what Fred de Cordova could not say out loud, what nobody on that staff wanted to put into words, was the thing that hung over every pre-show meeting that afternoon like weather. This might be the last time. This might be the last time George Burns sat in that chair. Because there are ages that sound like numbers, and then there are ages that sound like something else. Something that makes you sit very still and pay attention. And 92 was that kind of age. But what nobody in that studio knew, not the producers, not the makeup artists, not Ed McMahon warming up the audience out front, was that George Burns had not come to be celebrated. He had not come to remind America that he was still alive and still funny, although both of those things were spectacularly true. He had come to say something specific, something he had been carrying around for longer than most people in that building had been alive. Something about what it actually means to last. And what Johnny Carson was about to hear in that guest chair would stay with him for the rest of his life. If this story is already reaching you in a place you did not expect, stay with it. What happens in that studio in the next few minutes is something television has never quite recovered from. The green room at NBC Burbank was a modest space. Beige walls, a couch the color of old mustard, a television monitor showing the empty stage. George Burns sat in there at 4:45 that afternoon, wearing a dark gray suit with a lighter gray tie and a white pocket square folded into a clean point. His signature oversized glasses sat on his face with the particular solidity of something that had been in the same position for decades. The cigar was already going. A stagehand knocked and asked if he needed anything. George looked at him through those glasses with an expression of complete calm. "I need nothing," he said. "I have everything." The stagehand did not know what to do with that answer. He nodded and left. At 5 o'clock, Johnny came out of his dressing room. He walked the corridor toward the stage, passing the green room, when the door was open. He glanced inside and saw George sitting there alone, the cigar sending its thin smoke toward the ceiling, and the two men looked at each other for a moment across the doorway. Neither of them spoke, but the look that passed between them was the look of two people who have known each other long enough that speaking is sometimes the smaller part of communication. Johnny nodded once. George raised the hand, holding the cigar in a small gesture that meant, "I see you." Johnny kept walking toward the stage, and what was running through his mind in that corridor, nobody would know until years later when he finally spoke about it. Because Johnny Carson had been thinking about George Burns all day, not about the interview, about the number, about 92, about what it means to have outlasted your era and still be standing in a suit with a cigar and something worth saying, about whether any of us ever truly earns the right to feel that comfortable in our own skin. Wait until you hear what George Burns says in that chair, because the joke he tells is not the story. The story is what comes after the joke. Subscribe if you have not already, and drop your location in the comments. People are watching this from every corner of the world, and I want to know where you are. The taping began at 5:30 exactly. Doc Severinsen's band hit the theme with that particular Tuesday energy that longtime viewers could feel, even through a television screen. Ed McMahon's voice boomed through the studio. Johnny Carson emerged from behind the curtain, and the audience gave him the warm, unfamiliar welcome of people greeting someone they have been watching their whole lives. Johnny did his monologue, jokes about the Rose Bowl, about the new year, about the cold snap moving through the country. He was sharp, he was warm, he was every inch the man America turned to before bed. But his eyes kept moving toward the wings, toward the curtain on the right side of the stage, toward wherever George Burns was standing, waiting. When Ed McMahon made the introduction, he did something he almost never did. He paused before the name. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and then a beat of silence that was just long enough to feel intentional. A man who has been making America laugh since before the radio was invented. A man who has outlived every prediction anyone ever made about him. Still performing. Still here. George Burns. The audience did not just applaud. They stood before he even appeared. All 300 people in that studio rose to their feet before George Burns took a single step through that curtain, and the sound that came out of them was not the ordinary sound of a studio audience doing what studio audiences do. It was something older than that, something closer to gratitude. And then there he was, Dark gray suit, gray tie, white pocket square in a clean point, exactly as the stagehand had seen it in the green room. The glasses, the cigar, walking with that particular unhurried pace that was not slow because he was old, but slow because he had decided long ago that there was no particular rush, that everything worth arriving at would still be there when he got there. He reached the edge of the curtain, and he stopped. That was the moment. Well, the moment nobody had scripted. He stopped at the edge of the curtain, and he looked out at that standing audience, 300 people on their feet, making a noise that filled the room from the floor to the rigging above the lights. And something moved across his face that was not a performance. His chin lifted slightly. His eyes moved across the crowd, the way a man's eyes move when he is trying to memorize something. When he knows he is standing inside a moment he wants to keep. And then he spoke, into the applause, over the noise, in that gravelly voice that had been working for 9 decades. "I'm still here," he said. He said it simply and directly, and with the quietest, most devastating kind of wonder. "I'm still here." The applause stopped, not because people stopped feeling it, because those 3 words landed in the room like something physical, and everybody needed a second to absorb the impact. 300 people standing in silence, and Johnny Carson behind his desk with his hands folded, and his face doing something that the cameras caught, and that makeup could not have prepared for. Johnny Carson, who had held his composure through 30 years, and every kind of human drama television had ever produced, looked like a man who had just heard something that cracked straight through to the center of him. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright. And he did not speak. He just watched George Burns walk toward him, and he waited. And the audience, slowly, gently, began to applaud again. Softer this time, because the moment had changed into something that did not need volume. That is when the real story begins. Not the jokes that came after, though the jokes came and they were extraordinary. Not the stories about Gracie, though those came too. What happened in the next 20 minutes of that taping was a conversation between 2 men about something that is very hard to talk about on television, which is the question of what makes a life mean something when most of the people who knew you are gone. And George Burns had an answer that Johnny Carson had been looking for his entire career. Stay with this. The answer will not be what you expect. Johnny stood from behind his desk. He walked around it, which he did not do for every guest. He extended his hand, and George Burns took it. And they stood there in a handshake that lasted just a beat longer than handshakes usually last on television. The audience could feel the weight of it, and Johnny guided George to the guest chair, and they settled in. And there was a moment before the interview began where both men just looked at each other with an expression that the cameras caught from 2 different angles. And what it said was something like, "Here we are. Can you believe it? Here we are." Johnny leaned forward. "George," he said, "I have to ask you something before anything else. I want to ask you something I've never quite figured out how to ask anyone." George lifted the cigar and waited. "What is the secret?" Johnny said. "You are 92 years old. You are doing stand-up comedy. You are sharper than anyone half your age. What is the actual secret? Because I am watching America get older, and I am getting older, and nobody seems to know the answer." George Burns looked at him, not with the amused performance face he wore for jokes, with a different kind of face altogether, a face that had been in formation for 9 decades and had earned the right to say exactly what it thought. He took a long pull from the cigar and let the smoke go. Then he said something that nobody on the production staff had anticipated, something that hadn't been in any pre-interview notes, something that the show's researcher had not found in any previous interview. He said, "Johnny, there is no secret. The secret is that there is no secret." The audience laughed because that sounded like a joke. But it was not a joke, and George Burns held up one hand to stop the laughter, gently but clearly, the way a man stops traffic with a single gesture. "I mean that," he said. "People spend their whole lives looking for the thing that will make it easier. The trick, the method, the philosophy." He looked directly at Johnny. "There is no trick. There is only what you do with the years while you are arguing about whether there is a trick." Johnny did not say anything for a moment. He looked at George Burns with an expression that Ed McMahon would describe years later as the look Johnny had when something got all the way through. When something broke past the professional warmth and the quick wit and the performance and reached the actual man underneath. And then Johnny said something that wasn't in his index cards. He said, "I think about that a lot. I think about what I have been doing with the years." George Burns nodded slowly. Then he said, "Do you know what I think about every morning when I wake up? Every single morning without exception." Johnny shook his head. George took another pull from the cigar. "I think about Gracie," he said. The studio went still, because everybody in that room knew about Gracie Allen, knew that she had died in 1964, knew that George Burns had not remarried, knew that for 25 years he had been performing alone while carrying something inside him that was not visible in any interview he had ever given. "That was 25 years ago," Johnny said quietly. "Every morning." George nodded. "Every morning," he said. And then he said the thing that broke the interview wide open. "And I am grateful for it," he said. "I am grateful that I still miss her. Because the day I stop missing her is the day something important about me goes away. And I plan to keep that part of me alive for as long as I am alive." "But you do not understand yet," George said, looking at Johnny with those magnified eyes. "But you will. When someone you love is gone and the world keeps asking you to move on, the bravest thing you can do is refuse to pretend that moving on means forgetting." Johnny Carson looked down at his desk for a moment. The cameras caught it. Ed McMahon caught it. The audience caught it. Something in what George Burns had just said had landed somewhere very specific inside Johnny Carson, and everybody in that room could see it happening in real time. What did it land on? What was Johnny Carson carrying into that Tuesday taping in January of 1989 that made those particular words crack something open? That is the part of this story that took years to become known. And what it reveals about both men is something that neither of them would have chosen to say on camera. But somehow, in that room, with George Burns sitting across from him with his cigar and his 92 years, and his absolute refusal to perform anything other than the truth, Johnny said it anyway. Subscribe right now, because what Johnny admits next is something he had never said on television before, and would never say again in quite the same way. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. This story is going somewhere you do not expect. Johnny picked up his pen from the desk and turned it in his fingers for a moment, which was a thing he did when he was deciding whether to say what he was thinking. Then he set the pen down. He looked at George Burns. He said, "I envy you that." The audience was quiet. "I envy you the certainty of it," Johnny said. "You know what you are grateful for. You know what you are carrying. You know the thing that matters to you." He paused. "I've been sitting in this chair for 26 years, and I think the thing I am worst at is knowing what to be grateful for while it is still here." George Burns let a long moment pass. Then he said something that the audience would not fully understand until they thought about it later, on the drive home, lying in bed at night, standing in a kitchen in the morning, doing ordinary things. He said, "Johnny, that is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me on television. And I am going to tell you something that nobody has ever asked me, and therefore nobody has ever heard. He shifted forward in the chair slightly. Do you want to know when I started getting better at it? At knowing what to keep? Johnny said yes. George Burns said, when I stopped treating time like something I had. He let that sit in the air for a moment. I used to think about time the way a young man thinks about money when he has a lot of it. Like it will be there tomorrow. Like there is always more coming. He took a long pull from the cigar. The day I stopped thinking that way was the day I became the man you are looking at right now. Because I started treating every conversation like it was worth something. Every laugh like it was a gift. Every person sitting across from me like they were the reason I showed up. Johnny Carson was quiet for what felt like a very long time. The audience was quiet. Even the cameras seemed to hold their angle without moving. Then Johnny said, fought in a voice that was barely above his normal register, but contained something different inside it, something stripped of the professional smoothness. George, I hope you know that I have been waiting to hear that for a long time. George Burns smiled, not his stage smile, the other one. The one that people who knew him personally said was the real one, the one that went all the way up to the eyes and stayed there. I know, he said simply. That is why I said it. What happened over the next 12 minutes of that interview was something that Tonight Show producers had not budgeted time for and could not have prepared for even if they had. George Burns told stories that were not on the show's research cards, not the famous Gracie stories, though those were in there, not the Oscar story, not the Oh God story. He told a story about standing in a vaudeville theater in 1912, 17 years old, watching an audience laugh at something he had done, and feeling for the first time in his life that he had found the room he was supposed to be in. He said, I have been in that room ever since. Different walls, different chairs, different people in the seats. But the same room. And the people who have sat across from me in that room, he said, looking at Johnny, are the reason I kept showing up. Because you cannot make someone laugh alone. Comedy is not a solo act. It is a conversation. He paused. Everything that matters is a conversation. The audience applauded, and George Burns waited for it to settle, and then said something that might have been the most devastating sentence of the evening. He said, Do you know the only thing I regret? Johnny leaned forward. George said, That I did not know when I was young how fast it was going. If I had known, I would have been more present. I would have listened better. He looked out at the audience. I would have put down the newspaper. He waited for the laugh, and it came. Big, relieving. The laugh of a room that needed a moment of lightness, because what he had been saying was almost too much to hold. And then he added, quietly, after the laugh, I mean that. I really mean that. When the segment ended, the audience gave George Burns a standing ovation that lasted for nearly 3 minutes. 300 people in a television studio in Burbank, California in January 1989, standing for a 92-year-old man with a cigar and a gray suit, and standing in the particular way people stand when they are not applauding a performance, but witnessing something true. Johnny Carson stood too. He stood behind his desk with his hands together and his face open in a way that it was not usually open on television, and he looked at George Burns the way a student looks at a teacher at the moment of understanding. Not with deference, with recognition. Like, oh, you have been trying to tell me this for years, and I am only now capable of hearing it. George Burns stood slowly from the guest chair. He straightened his jacket. He took a long, last pull from the cigar. And before he turned to leave, he did something that wasn't in the show notes, not in the production plan, not in any interview he had given before. He turned to face the camera. Not Johnny. The camera. The lens. The 30 million people on the other side of it, watching from their living rooms. He looked directly into it for a moment that was just long enough to feel like something. Then he said, "I'm still here." He smiled. "Stay as long as you can." Then he turned and walked back through the curtain with that same unhurried pace, and the audience stayed on their feet until the curtain was still. Ed McMahon said afterward, in more than one interview, that he had been doing television for 30 years at that point, and he had never felt the studio go that quiet and that full at the same time. Quiet and full. That was how he described it. Like the room had been filled with something that was also very still. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk for a moment after George Burns disappeared through the curtain. He sat there looking at the curtain. Then he turned back to the camera and said something that was not a joke. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, that man is 92 years old, and he is still figuring it out, which means the rest of us have no excuse." He paused. He picked up the pen on his desk and looked at it. Then he set it back down. He was not willing to be done yet, he said, and I think that is the finest thing one human being can say about another. The tape of that Tonight Show episode was broadcast that night at 11:30. By midnight, NBC's viewer call line was receiving more calls than on any non-news night in years. Not asking questions, not complaining. People calling to say that something had happened to them while watching. That they had been sitting in a chair in their living room, watching a 92-year-old man on a television show, and something had shifted. Something had loosened. Something that had been held tight for years. People called about their parents they had not spoken to. About years they felt they had wasted. About gratitude they had been deferring. About time. About time. About time. One letter that arrived at NBC 2 weeks later, written by a woman in Akron, Ohio, said simply, "I watched George Burns on Tuesday, and I called my mother the next morning for the first time in 4 years. Thank you for airing that." There were thousands of letters like it. George Burns continued performing after that appearance. He turned 93 on January 20th, 10 days after the taping. He performed stand-up into his late 90s. And he released his book, All My Best Friends, in 1989, the same year as the interview. He booked Carnegie Hall for his 100th birthday in 1996, though his health prevented him from performing it. He died on March 9th, 1996, at 100 years old, in his Beverly Hills home. According to the people around him in those final years, he never stopped talking about Gracie, never stopped lighting the cigar, never stopped showing up. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in May of 1992. In his retirement, when asked what he considered the most important interviews of his career, he named a short list. George Burns was on it. Not for a specific exchange, not for a joke, for the feeling in the room that night, for the way a man who had every reason to be finished kept arriving, kept being present. He kept refusing to treat the conversation as something less than the whole point. He was still here, Johnny said, and he made you want to be too. What George Burns understood, what he had learned somewhere in 9 decades of vaudeville stages and radio studios and film sets and Tonight Show chairs, was something that most of us spend our whole lives trying to avoid knowing, that the years do not wait, that the room you are in right now, the people in front of you right now, the conversation happening right now, is the thing. Not the thing that leads to the thing itself, and the only way to honor it is to be fully inside it. With the cigar, with the glasses, with the gravelly voice, and the old jokes and the new ones, and the grief that is also a form of love, and the gratitude that is also a form of courage. Still here. Stay as long as you can. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Someone who has been putting off the call. Someone who has been treating time like something they have in surplus. Someone who needs a 92-year-old man in a gray suit to remind them that the room you are in right now is the room you were looking for. Subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. Stories about the moments when television stopped being television and became something true. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me who in your life is still here that you have not called. Because George Burns would tell you to put down whatever you are holding and make the call. And I think he would be right.